Chapter 5. Kiss and Say Nothing. The verdict concerning the 5 terrorists was pronounced finally and confirmed upon the same day. The condemned were not told when the execution would take place, but they knew from the usual procedure that they would be hanged the same night, or, at the very least, upon the following night. And when it was proposed to them that they meet their relatives upon the following Thursday, they understood that the execution would take place on Friday at dawn. Tanya Kovalchuk had no near relatives, and those whom she had were somewhere in the wilderness in Little Russia, and it was not likely that they even knew of the trial or of the coming execution. Musya and Werner, as unidentified people, were not supposed to have relatives, and only 2, Sergei Golovin and Vasily Kashurin, were to meet their parents. Both of them looked upon that meeting with terror and anguish. Yet they dare not refuse the old people the last word, the last kiss. Sergei Golovin was particularly tortured by the thought of the coming meeting. He dearly loved his father and mother. He had seen them but a short while before, and now he was in a state of terror as to what would happen when they came to see him. The execution itself, in all its monstrous horror, in its brain-stunning madness, he could imagine more easily, and it seemed less terrible than these other few moments of meeting, brief and unsatisfactory, which seemed to reach beyond time, beyond life itself. How to look, what to think, what to say, his mind could not determine. The most simple and ordinary act, to take his father by the hand, to kiss him, and to say, "How do you do, father?" seemed to him unspeakably horrible in its monstrous, inhuman, absurd deceitfulness. After the sentence, the condemned were not placed together in one cell, as Tanya Kovalchuk had supposed they would be, but each was put in solitary confinement, and all morning, until 11 o'clock, when his parents came, Sergei Golovin paced his cell furiously, tugged at his beard, frowned pitiably, and muttered inaudibly. Sometimes he would stop abruptly, would breathe deeply, then exhale like a man who is being too long under water. But he was so healthy, his young life was so strong within him, that even in the moments of his most painful suffering his blood played under his skin, reddening his cheeks, and his blue eyes shone brightly and frankly. But everything was far different from what he had anticipated. Nikolai Sergeyevich Golovin, Sergei's father, a retired colonel, was the first to enter the room where the meeting took place. He was all white, his face, his beard, his hair, and his hands, as if he were a snow statue, attired in man's clothes. He had on the same old but well-cleaned coat, smelling of benzine, with new shoulder straps crosswise, that he had always worn, and he entered firmly, with an air of stateliness, with strong and steady steps. He stretched out his white, thin hand, and said loudly, "How do you do, Sergei?" Behind him, Sergei's mother entered with short steps, smiling strangely, but she also pressed his hands and repeated loudly, "How do you do, Seryojizenska?" She kissed him on the lips and sat down silently. She did not rush over to him. She did not burst into tears. She did not break into a sob. She did not do any of the terrible things which Sergei had feared. She just kissed him and silently sat down, and with her trembling hands she even adjusted her black silk dress. Sergei did not know that the colonel, having locked himself all the previous night in his little study, had deliberated upon this ritual with all his power. "We must not aggravate, but ease the last moment of our son," resolved the colonel firmly, and he carefully weighed every possible phrase of the conversation, every act and movement that might take place on the following day. But somehow he became confused, forgetting what he had prepared, and he wept bitterly in the corner of the oilcloth-covered couch. In the morning he explained to his wife how she should behave at the meeting. "The main thing is, kiss, and say nothing," he taught her. "Later you may speak, after a while, but when you kiss him, be silent. Don't speak right after the kiss. Do you understand? Or you will say what you should not say." "I understand, Nikolai Sergeyev," answered the mother, weeping. "And you must not weep. For God's sake, do not weep. You will kill him if you weep, old woman." "Why do you weep?" "With women one cannot help weeping, but you must not weep. Do you hear?" "Yes, very well, Nikolai Sergeyevich." Riding in the Droizin, he had intended to school her in the instructions again, but he forgot, and so they rode in silence, bent, both grey and old, and they were lost in thought, while the city was gay and noisy. It was Shrovetide, and the streets were crowded. They sat down. Then the colonel stood. Then the colonel stood up, assumed a studied pose, placing his right hand upon the border of his coat. Sergei sat for an instant, looked closely upon the wrinkled face of his mother, and then jumped up. "Be seated, Shurvizgenska," begged the mother. "Sit down, Sergei," repeated the father. They became silent. The mother smiled. "How we have petitioned for you," said Sergeygenska. "Father!" "You should not have done that, mother." The colonel spoke firmly. "We had to do it, Sergei, so that you should not think your parents had forsaken you." They became silent again. It was terrible for them to utter even a word, as though each word in the language had lost its individual meaning and meant but one thing: death. Sergei looked at his father's coat, which smelt of benzine, and thought, "They have no servant now, consequently he must have cleaned it himself. How is it that I have never before noticed when he cleaned his coat? I suppose he does it in the morning." Suddenly he asked, "How is sister? Is she well?" Nino Chica does not know anything," the mother answered hastily. The colonel interrupted her sternly. "Why should you tell a falsehood? The child read it in the newspapers. Let Sergei know that everybody, that those who are dearest to him, were thinking of him at this time, and—" He could not say any more, and stopped. Suddenly the mother's face contracted. Then it spread out, became agitated, wet, and wild-looking. Her discolored eyes stared blindly, and her breathing became more frequent, and briefer, louder. Serge, she repeated, without moving her lips. "Serge!" "Dear mother!" The colonel strode forward, all quivering in every fold of his coat, in every wrinkle of his face, not understanding how terrible he himself looked in his death-like whiteness, in his heroic, desperate firmness. He said to his wife, "Be silent! Don't torture him! Don't torture him! He has to die! Don't torture him!" Frightened, she had already become silent, but she still shook his clenched fists before him, and repeated, "Don't torture him!" Then he stepped back, placing his trembling hands behind his back, and loudly, with an expression of forced calm, asked with pale lips, "When?" "Tomorrow morning," answered Sergei, his lips also pale. The mother looked at the ground, chewing her lips as if she did not hear anything, and continued to chew. She uttered these simple words, strangely, as though they dropped like lead. "Nikochina told me to kiss you, Sergenska." "Kiss her for me," said Sergei. "Very well. The Kiovskos send you their regards." "Which Kiovskos?" "Oh, yes," the colonel interrupted. "Well, we must go. Get up, mother. We must go." The two men lifted the weakened old woman. "Bid him good-bye," ordered the colonel. "Make the sign of the cross." She did everything as she was told, but as she made the sign of the cross and kissed her son a brief kiss, she shook her head and murmured weakly, "No, it isn't the right way. It's not the right way. What will I say? How will I say it? No, it is not the right way." "Goodbye, Sergei," said the father. They shook hands and kissed each other quickly but heartily. "You—" began Sergei. "Well?" asked the father abruptly. No, it is not the right way. How shall I say it?" repeated the mother weakly, nodding her head. She had sat down again, and was rocking herself back and forth. "You—" Sergei began again. Suddenly his face wrinkled pitiably, childishly, and his eyes filled with tears immediately. Though through the sparkling gleams of his tears he looked closely into the white face of his father, whose eyes had also filled. "You, father, are a noble man." "What is that? What are you saying?" said the colonel, surprised. Then suddenly, as if broken in two, he fell with his head upon his son's shoulders. He had been taller than Sergei, but now he became short, and his dry, downy head lay like a white ball upon his son's shoulder. And they kissed silently and passionately. Sergei kissed the silvery white hair, and the old man kissed the prisoner's garb. "And I?" suddenly said a loud voice. They looked around. Sergei's mother was standing, her head thrown back, looking at them angrily, almost with contempt. "What is it, mother?" cried the colonel. "And I?" she said, shaking her head with insane intensity. You kiss? And I? You men? Yes, and I? And I? Mother! Sergei rushed over to her. What took place then is unnecessary and impossible to describe. The last words of the colonel were, I give you my blessing for your death, Sergeyevska. Die bravely, like an officer. And they went away. Somehow they went away. They had been there, they had stood, they had spoken, and suddenly they had gone. Here sat his mother, there stood his father, and, suddenly, somehow, they had gone away. Returning to the cell, Sergei lay down on the cot, his face turned towards the wall, in order to hide it from the soldiers, and he wept for a long time. Then, exhausted by his tears, he slept soundly.